Welcome to the New Books Network.
And, I have heard often the fact that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but something like 90% of the indigenous population of North America died from disease
That is
when
true, yeah.
Europeans came over. And that blows my mind. I mean, just
Yeah.
imagine 90% of your town perishing. I
Yeah.
mean, that's apocalyptic,
Yeah.
and that really
not all of them perished from disease, but many also perished from the very fact, that the whole productive system was disrupted. There was no peasants anymore to work in the fields and so on. So there was a hunger epidemia going hand in hand with the with the illnesses and so on, and so that all really had devastating effects. And if we compare it to the pandemics of our own days, of course, we might see the difference. This is really the huge demographic catastrophe of human history. That is what happened in the Americas in that period.
Hi, everyone. This is AJ Woodhams, host of the War Books podcast, where I interview today's best authors writing about war-related topics. Today, I am super excited to have on the show Stefan Rinke, who wrote the new book, Conquistadors and Aztecs, A History of the Fall of Tenochtitlan. Stefan is professor and chair of the Department of History at the Institute of Latin American Studies and member of the Friedrich Meinecke Institute at Freie Universität Berlin. From 2014 to 2017, he was president of the European Association of Historians of Latin America. Rinke is the recipient of the Jose Antonio Alzate Award from the Mexican Academy of Sciences and is the author of 14 books, most of which have been translated into Spanish, Portuguese, and English. Stefan, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. For joining me today. And forewarning for this interview, I'm going to butcher so many pronunciations. Before we get started, is Tenochtitlan. That's how we pronounce that, correct?
Well, actually, nobody knows exactly how it was pronounced, so don't worry about it. And of course, Tenochtitlan is quite good.
Okay, great. All right. Well, since it's such an important topic, I wanted to at least get your expertise on how to pronounce that. And this is another interview that I think is going to be fantastic because this is one of those topics that so your book is about, the fall of Tenochtitlan and the Spanish conquests in the Americas in the 1500s. We haven't had anybody talk about this yet on my show. We get a lot of World War II, a lot of World War I, and some of these more well-known conflicts. But this is one of those topics that I knew nothing about. Well, not nothing. I knew like what I learned from school and in the basics. But it was such a fascinating topic, I thought, and I'm so glad that you're here today talking about it. Well, first, if you mind just saying in your own words, what is your book about?
My book is about a global historical event of great significance, which until the day of today is remembered by almost everyone in the Western world because it's considered to be a constitutive moment in our history. It's about the fall of the great empire of the Aztecs or the Mexica people who dominated large parts of Mesoamerica in that period and who had built up for centuries a strong and mighty empire. And this is so significant because the Europeans who had come to the New World a couple of decades earlier, as we all know, with Columbus in 1492, had until that point not yet discovered really well-organized empires, but rather smaller groups on the Caribbean islands, which they quickly dominated and also unhappily exterminated. And in Mesoamerica, what they what they met was completely different. It went beyond their imaginations, and it was a full-blown empire, which was, of course, very different from what they knew from Europe, but from their own impressions, it also looked impressive. It looked powerful. It had all the ingredients of a mighty civilization of its own, and so these Europeans were amazed and shocked. And by bringing down that empire, they really built the fundaments for creating the first phase of European colonialism, which unto our very day is important and influencing our own history and present.
Well, let's talk about some of the history of the time in between. So the fall of Tenochtitlan happens in 1521. And, obviously Columbus came in 1492. So you've got about 30 years, a 30-year time period. What's going on in that 30-year time period from the time that Columbus sets foot in the Americas to the fall of Tenochtitlan?
Yeah, it's a period of trial and error of Spanish settlement in the Caribbean. The Spaniards are continuing to look for the breakthrough to the Pacific. They look for the breakthrough to India, which has from the very beginning been their objective, to reach there and not to discover a new continent, which was, of course, coincidental. And so they are continuing their voyages of exploration. Columbus does so many. He does many different trips, but there are also very soon other explorers coming to the region and looking for this channel, for this breakthrough to really get where they really wanted to go, and that was not the New World, but it was Asia. It was the riches of India and the spices of the Spice Islands and China, of course. And so that's what they do. But they also start settling in the Caribbean, and these settlements turn out to be, of course, highly thought about, because there are people living there. These are not empty islands, but there are Taino people, there are Carib people, and others who have been living on these islands for quite a while. And while some of them were at the first moment quite welcoming to the foreigners, it soon turned out that convivence would be hard to get, and that the Spaniards were quite oppressive in their relations with the inhabitants, with the autochthonous peoples. And so it came to the first warfare there, and in these small wars, the Europeans were able to hold their ground, and they were then enslaving the indigenous population. They were exploiting them, and they were looking for gold. Everywhere they went, they would be looking for gold, and there wasn't that much gold on the Caribbean islands. So they were soon also pretty frustrated, and the settlements, the colonization, did not bring the desired riches that Europeans were out for. They didn't want to settle permanently in the New World, but they went there in order to get rich and to get back to Spain and have a nice life there. But it turned out that these hopes were kind of frustrated, and so there was this motivation to go on to continue looking for where the riches really are. And then, of course, by exploring the Caribbean Sea, they would also come across the mainland, and they first did so actually in the regions which are now Panama, Costa Rica, and so on, and also the northern part of Venezuela and Colombia. And only later did they manage to get to the peninsula of Yucatan, and there, of course, they already experienced quite different kind of peoples, the Maya people, who had a highly developed standard of city states and so on, and that is what interested them. And then, after having consecutively conquered the islands, and also the island of Cuba, which turned out to be a springboard to the mainland. That is then when they, in 1519, made this step across the Straits of Cuba to the mainland.
So militarily, what kind of force are the Spaniards? First of all, before that, what are the other? Is it just the Spanish in this 30-year time period that are in this region?
Yes, it's mainly it's all under the rule of the Spanish crown. But the people who go there, of course, Columbus himself was not an original Spaniard, and the sailors he had on board came from all different regions of Spain. But there was also some African slaves among them. We know that there were some Jewish people among them whom they took as translators, and so it was kind of a mixed group. But mainly they considered themselves to be subjects to the King of Spain.
Well, militarily, what was Spain bringing with them to the Americas? What kind of fighting force? What kind of weapons did they use? Their armor, their tactics, the leadership. Talk about militarily the situation.
Yeah, we have to really go away from this idea that this was a regular military force. This is the image that the Spaniards, Cortés, the leader of the Spaniards themselves, tried to bring across in their histories after the fall of Tenochtitlan. What it really was we would call them a gang of mercenaries, a band of people who put their luck and their fate on this military adventure, and they would gather around a strong commander whom they would have to be loyal to. They were actually, once they joined the group, they were not allowed to move away and go back. That was to be punishable by death. So, but what they did was they, in a way, sold their power. They sold their bodies to this leader, but they also had the right to expect a share of the booty. So what it was a community looking out for booty, a bounty, a group of bounty seekers, so to say. And they were out, of course, in the main for gold, and also for some slaves if they could get them. So that was their main motivation. And when they got from Cuba to the mainland, it was, of course, also those people who had not had the luck to get a big share of what was there to get in Cuba. So those were rather the frustrated people, those who had already some experience in fighting indigenous people in the Caribbean islands, but they had not made or they had not been, very lucky in that they didn't have big riches in order to build a life on. So they were still waiting for their next opportunity, and this move to the mainland was their main opportunity. In terms of weapons, they did have, swords. They had iron weapons, which of course steel weapons, which of course was a big advantage later on in the fight against the indigenous people, because they did not have that. And they also had some firearms. They had muskets and small cannons. They also had animals which were not known in the New World, and those were, for example, horses and dogs. Bloodhounds, very important in warfare in the Caribbean and also on the mainland in these early years of European colonization. And and they also had, of course, armory. breast armors and helmets and so on. So that was all what they basically, the kind of equipment that people in Europe would also have. And of course, this equipment was being bought by themselves. So it was their own property. They had to bring it to the battlefields. They were not equipped by some state or by some central agency, but that was their own. Usually it was their own equipment. Of course, then also the commander of the band would also try to equip his soldiers to a different degree, and then they would have to pay that back by not getting as much of the bounty as the others would, who had brought their swords and so on. So it was all a give and take. It was a really quite a group, a heterogeneous group who would get there together. And in doing that, they also followed traditions which they had exercised in the Iberian Peninsula before fighting the Moorish people. So that was not absolutely new to warfare in the New World, but they had already done so before in their fight against the Arabs on the Iberian Peninsula.
Now, were most of these mercenaries or these gangs, were they, obviously it was the Spanish crown they were fighting under, but were they themselves Spanish, or did they come from other parts?
Well, Spanish is a big word in that period. There was not yet a unified Spanish state. It was in the making by the end of the 15th century. There were many different measures trying to introduce, a Spanish grammar, for example, what for the first time invented in 1492. Of course, it was also the end of the reconquest of the Spanish peninsula from the Arab peoples. And it was also the time of the expulsion of the Jewish and Arab people. So there were many different steps in trying to turn these very heterogeneous single kingdoms into what we would consider a more modern kind of unified state. But basically, the main percentage of people came from the south. They came from Andalusia. They were experienced seamen, but as I said before, there were also people from other regions of Spain. But we don't know exactly each and every one of them, but there were some African slaves, and there were also some Jews who were officially not permitted to join, but they were taken on board because they were considered to be linguistic geniuses and probably able to talk to the king of China, the Khan, the big Khan, which they were actually heading for. So that was a very heterogeneous group under Cologne. And then later on from the Caribbean, of course, also officially speaking, only Spaniards of pure blood were allowed to go to the colonies, and were by that time not yet considered colonies, but rather settlements, and only those of pure blood, that is of Christian ancestry, who did not have Jewish or Arab ancestors, were officially allowed to go to the New World. And we know that was not always kept, this rule, but we also know that the great majority of people who would go there in this early phase would come from the Iberian Peninsula.
Well, let's shift our focus then to the Aztecs, and just for everyone in the audience who needs a refresher from high school, could you maybe just give a brief overview of the Aztecs and how big their empire was, what its leadership was, where on a map specifically Tenochtitlan is? Just talk a little bit about the Aztecs.
Yeah, the Aztecs were originally one of those many nomad peoples who in the Mesoamerican region, and Mesoamerica, for those who are not familiar with this concept, includes what is today Mexico and also parts of the southwest of the United States and the northern part of Central America. This is called has been called Mesoamerica because it is considered to be a cultural region, a region of unity. And the Aztecs had originally migrated from the north towards the south. Of course, this is all not very well historically documented, but there are these Aztec myths from which we learn that, and they had finally, after many challenges and fights and so on, they had settled at the place where an eagle was sitting on a cactus and eating a snake, and that was this is a symbol which is still in the Mexican flag until the very day until today, and this is was a small island in the lake of Texcoco, and this is a place which they called then later on Tenochtitlan, and they were not from the beginning a powerful people, but they were rather people which had to pay tribute to their neighbors, and they were dependent on them. But they were also from the very beginning, at least that is what their own legends tell us, a very warlike people. They were good warriors and so on, and in the course of many centuries they managed to come out ever more powerful in this landscape where so many different people would compete and live more or less closely together, and in doing so their own city state would become more powerful and more powerful, and then it would start to expand and also subdue its neighbors and become the seat of an empire. That was a process that really started to get very dynamic about 100 years before the Spaniards came. So it was not a very long.
It's pretty young. Would you say it's a pretty young empire then?
It's a pretty young empire, exactly. They were still expanding when the Spaniards came, and of course their empire was very much characterized by being an empire which was not only built on their weapons but also on their beliefs, on their religious beliefs, because the Aztecs and many other people in the region believed that in order to keep the circle of or the exchange of night and day, it was important to sacrifice humans and to feed the gods with human blood and human hearts. And so this was a major part of Mesoamerican civilization. As I said, not only the Aztecs practiced that, but other peoples, including the Maya and smaller groups too. And so that was a major aspect. So when they expanded, when they led their wars against their neighbors and so on, they would make captives who were then sacrificed in ritualistic, sacrifices on the big pyramids of Tenochtitlan, which by then had been built. Tenochtitlan had turned into one of the biggest cities in the world, actually, in the world. It was not only and by far the biggest city in the Americas at that point, in the Western Hemisphere, but it was one of the biggest cities in the world.
Yeah, how big was, by 1500, by the time the Spanish are there, how many people are living under the Aztec
There
Empire?
are different calculations, but we can talk about 200,000, which is really enormous for
just in Tenochtitlan or in
just in Tenochtitlan,
Okay.
yeah, and of course we're talking about a city on an island in a lake, and of course so the expansion of that city was kind of restricted, but they still made it. They gained land from the lake by drying the lake at some points, and by also using parts of the lakes with their famous cultivation systems for producing agricultural goods and so on. So they were very, very ingenious in their inventions. They had, of course, this was a saltwater lake, so they needed fresh water. They built channels for that, and it was really an amazing construction, something that Europeans would never have expected to exist outside the Christian world, because, of course, they considered themselves to be, the top of creation. And when they found out, oh no, there are other people who can do many things even better than we do, that was really shattering their beliefs at that point. Yeah, so there are many different aspects which I could talk about actually, but perhaps those are the main ones to remember. And of course, it's also interesting that you mentioned high school, because, as I said before, I think for us living in the Western world, it's still part of our heritage. It's still something we learn in school, although, of course, for a European and also for North American like you, it happened quite far away, but still it's considered to be part and parcel of our global history.
Yeah, and well, I mean, here in North America, I mean, all over the world, this is the case right now with colonialism. And one of the things that's very interesting about your book too is there's a real reconsideration of how we have historically how we have taught these events in our history, in Western history. Because going through school, of course, like we hear the story of the conquerors, of the Spanish, of the Europeans who came over, and Columbus is this very exalted figure, and we don't really talk too much about the different empires that were there. Although I think it's probably well known that nobody really thinks that the conquistadors were the good guys, but you still don't. It kind of stops at that. I'm curious, in Europe, how is Columbus taught in Europe?
Well, that has also underwent some change. Originally, of course, there was this story or this narrative of the big European hero who would go out there and then find the new world and open it up to Christianity and civilization, European style, and so on. But then, let's say from about the 60s, 70s onwards, this critical view of Columbus took hold slowly but surely. It took a while. It took some decades to really get into the school textbooks too. It was more of an academic or university scholarly change of opinion first, and it took a while. But then when it finally entered textbooks, it turned the whole view of Columbus and the Spaniards around. So now the Spaniards were considered to be the bad guys, the monsters who wiped out indigenous civilizations, which had been wonderful civilizations, peaceful, and what do I know, And of course, that is also a myth which doesn't hold true. And we have to consider that what the Spaniards entered into when they came there in 1519 was a very war-torn region where people were out to subdue each other, and they were just looking to take advantage of weaknesses the others would show, and where they were out to make captives and to sacrifice them, and to also, a major instrument in that region was to have them pay tribute, and that tribute included every kinds of produce, what have you, but also captives, young women, young men who were supposed to be either slaves or also to be sacrificed. But of course, it was better to sacrifice people who had been taken captives during a war. That was considered to be more. It had more honor, if you made a captive and offered that guy, then to buy a slave and offer them, that was not considered to be equal. But, so this is a very war-torn region where there's almost a permanent kind of warfare. And there's always, the smaller dependent states who look for their opportunity in order to get out of that situation of dependency and oppression. And now, when the Spaniards come, they can, of course, take advantage of that, and they can play one side against the other, and that's what they do.
Well, I want to come back to this when we start talking about one of the things that you do learn in school, or I remember learning in school, is that 400 Spanish, they took on this whole empire and they conquered the city, and it was because of their technology. But you write about how that's a myth, and I want to come back to that. But before we talk about that, can you just talk about how the Aztecs waged war? Similar to how we were talking about the Spanish, the types of weapons they used, their equipment, their armor. How was war waged by the Aztecs at this time?
First of all, there was a special season for war, and that was after the harvest period, when people would be free and would have the time. So that's very important. They would not wage war all of the year, and they would only do that during daytime, not at nights, because it was considered not to be convenient for the gods if you would fight by night. So you would do that only during the daytime. And then there were different kinds of wars. There were, of course, the wars of expansion, which a new king, a new Tlatoani, which is, if you translate the word, it means speaker, the one who's allowed to speak, who's the first, who is the tongue of the people, so to say, which a new Tlatoani had to carry out in order to prove that he was really capable of being the leader of the Aztecs. So his own capacities was measured by his successes in war. So that's the one thing. He had to do these kind of wars to prove himself after he had been installed as the new ruler. Then there are other kinds of wars which were called the so-called flower wars, and these wars were not out for or were not led for destroying the opponents, but rather to make captives for the sacrifices. These flower wars were especially fought against one group of indigenous peoples, the Tlaxcaltecs, which lived in the city of Tlaxcala, had their own city-state in Tlaxcala, which is close to the modern city of Puebla. Now it's still there. Tlaxcala still exists. If you go to Mexico, you should visit it. It's a great city, and with a lot of history, with some wonderful museums. And the Tlaxcaltecas were considered to be enemies by the Aztecs, and they were a small city-state, but they were not, and they were surrounded by the Aztec Empire, but they had not yet been conquered, because they were considered to be the opponents in these flower wars. So people, they would fight these wars without trying to extinguish their opponents, but rather it was like a training ground for young warriors, and also for the more elderly warriors, for the more mature warriors, in order to keep in training and to make captives. And also the Tlaxcaltecas, although they were few and they were a small state, were considered to be very, very brave and warlike people. So that was a very special phase. But then, of course, the third type of warfare was the warfare of conquest, of conquering other city-states in the vicinity of Tenochtitlan. And of course, the more the empire expanded, the farther they got to the north and also to the south of Mexico, where they would conquer these city-states. They would burn down the temple usually, but before they do, they would also take all the statues, the gods, and incorporate them into their own pantheon. And what they would do was they would kill the top echelon, the elite of this conquered city, but they would not wipe out all the people there, but would rather install a new dependent kind of rulership who had to pay tribute then. So what they did was they established a sort of dependency, and then had these newly conquered city pay in kind, pay what the region would produce, whether it were feathers or the skins of leopards and other materials which were not so abundant in the region of Tenochtitlan, which were considered to be luxury goods. Cacao would also be considered to be a luxury good, and so on. So that had to be delivered on a yearly basis, and it was quite onerous. So the dependent peoples had to go a long way to produce this tribute, so they would be held in dependence.
If you were just your average soldier fighting in the Aztec Empire, do you have a sword? Do you have a spear? What's your typical profile of a soldier in the Aztec Empire?
Yeah, the army itself was a very hierarchical body. And the top soldiers were really stars. They were really considered to be almost godlike creatures and instilled by godlike powers. But the regular army, so to say, the commoners would be equipped with swords and spears, also with the so-called atlatl, which is a kind of a throwing mechanism to throw spears, with more power. And they would also have some kind of body wear, in order to protect themselves, which was made of cotton, big cotton. And actually the Spaniards later adopted that because it was so much lighter to wear than their iron armors in the heat of Mexico, of course, and so they would wear that. But what they did not have was metal weapons. They had their weapon was made of a stone that was sharpened and so on. So it was a deadly weapon, but a weapon that would break quite easily, in fights. So that was, of course, a disadvantage when fighting against the Spaniards. So there was some kind of technological advantage, obviously, on the side of the Spaniards, but that would never have been sufficient to win these wars if it hadn't been for other factors.
Yeah, well, let's then fast forward a little bit to Cortés when he arrives and his march towards Tenochtitlan happens. Let's talk a little bit about this campaign. First, I guess we haven't talked too much about Cortés, but just briefly, what was Cortés's role once he arrived with all of his mercenaries in the Americas? What was his role? What was he seeking out to do? And then how did he come upon Tenochtitlan?
Well, first of all, he did not arrive with a group of mercenaries in the New World. He was rather, one of those younger sons, or well, he was not a younger son. He was the first son. He was first and only son of his father, but one of these people of the lower aristocracy who did not have much chances in life in Spain and in the Iberian Peninsula after the wars against the Arabs had been fought. And so he was looking for a new life, for a chance, for some opportunities, like all the other Spaniards too. He wanted to get rich and he wanted to get fame and what a young aristocrat of his time would look for. And so he went to the New World and he came there, and he did have some relatives, not brothers and so, but rather father relatives, where he would show up and say, here I am, can you help me in getting started? And so he did have, of course, a privileged start as compared to the commoners, but he had to go through, many different jobs, so to say, until becoming the mayor of a town in Cuba, and was considered to be an audacious and also kind of quite intelligent younger leader when in 1519 the governor of Cuba finally had the idea of sending an expedition to the mainland. But Cortés, of course, pretty soon developed a high sense of independence and wanted to do his own thing. So he started the expedition, and he did so contrary to the order of the governor, who in the last moment tried to prevent him from going.
So he just rounded up a big group of these mercenaries.
Yeah, he had rounded up a big group of warriors to accompany him, and then with the 3 ships he set out to the mainland, but already against the orders of the governor. So he was had already fallen from grace, so to say. And so for him personally, it was not possible to go back, because he knew that he would be hanged if he got back. So he had to, he was condemned to be successful. Otherwise, it would not work out well for him. His soldiers, of course, as I said before, many of them were kind of frustrated from their existence in Cuba and were looking out for a new challenge, and they put all their luck into the hands of Cortés and went with him. But when they were finally there and found out what it was they had to fight against, many had second thoughts and had wanted to go back. But Cortés, of course, did not have the chance to go back. He knew that the revenge of the governor would be kind of mortal for him, and so he had to stay on the ground, and he made his troops follow him. And
he was seeking gold, is that correct? Not necessarily
Yes,
conquest?
They were seeking gold, but once they had found out that there was this huge empire out there, they were facing. Cortés's idea was also to gain that empire for his king, because he knew he wouldn't get the grace of his governor again. So what he did was he considered himself under the direct command of the king, and in order to satisfy the king's demands, he knew that in the end the new world would have to produce the riches that everybody had hoped for when in 1419 or 1493 the news of this big exploration had finally reached Europe, But then, of course, in the 30 years that followed, there was not that much riches coming to Europe, and Cortés's thinking was, if I make it to produce riches and also to present my king, this highly developed empire as a gift, then I would, it wouldn't matter that that I had betrayed the governor, but I would be fine. And that was his reasoning, and that was actually the ideas that he was following when you explain his motivation.
So talk about when he reaches Tenochtitlan, when Cortés and his men they're at the doorstep of Tenochtitlan. What happens? How do events transpire between Cortés and the Aztecs?
Yes, this is also another world historical movement. The troops finally, after a long and arduous expedition through the mainland of Mexico, or what now is Mexico, had made it to the Valley of Mexico, and what they had seen from afar had already, been beyond their imagination. All these powerful, huge buildings, the temple circuit with these huge pyramid and so on. So they had seen that and they were baffled. And now that they were going down the mountain range to the island there, to the island city of Tenochtitlan, they were received actually by the Aztecs on one of the bridges they had built, and they were received in a very ceremonious manner, in a ritualistic manner, by the very Tlatoani himself in a highly organized ceremony. And of course, what really happened, we don't know. We just know what Cortés said. And Cortés, in his famous letters to the king, in his Cartas de Relación, says that in this first contact, the king of the Aztecs had already submitted himself to the rule of this foreign king, and that Cortés had taken him more or less in the place of the king as a new vassal of his own king. Of course, it's highly dubious that mattered, that happened. But what is true is that the Aztecs actually led the Spaniards and their allies, and that is most important. That were not just a few hundred Spaniards, but their allies, including the Tlaxcaltecans, into their city. They took them in, they hosted them, they gave them the palace of Moctezuma's father to live in, and they treated them as guests of honor, so to say. And until this very day, historians do not really know what was the strategy that Moctezuma had in mind when doing that. And of course, that was a crucial moment, because once these Spaniards and their allies were in the city, events would develop that the Aztecs could not completely control anymore. My own thesis is that they thought having them in the city would give them the power to control these, foreigners, which they could not really tell what they were about, what they wanted, and what they were. And so they probably thought that it would be good to have them and treat them well, but at the same time, have them more or less under custody. But as it turned out, that was not what happened.
Yeah, it does seem like, so Tenochtitlan itself, it's an island in the middle of a lake, and it seems like a pretty protected place. I mean, do you think that had Moctezuma not let Cortés in, that he would have been able to conquer the city at all?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, it's hard to tell. We know that later on he did, because Cortés and his allies, they had to flee the city after the events of the Noche Triste, the sad night, and then they waged a big war of siege, and which in the end would be successful. But and as I said before, for Cortés, there was not much of an alternative than to wage a successful war. So he would have probably continued. But
so how many with his allies in total? What is Cortés's full fighting force?
Yeah, we don't know that exactly, because Cortés obviously is silent about that in order to make his own effort more important than it actually was. But we have to think about a couple of thousand people who were fighting on his side. And also numbers were changing, because depending on the luck in the warfare, some city would at one day side with Cortés and his allies, and then when they were fought back by the Aztecs, they would change sides back again. So it was a very dynamic situation. But basically, the mainstay of Cortés's troops was, of course, his own Europeans, and then the Tlaxcaltecans, and later on also the people from partly from Texcoco and so on. So that was and the more the power of the Aztecs faded, the larger the number of Aztecs troops became.
So what's
of Cortés's troops became. I'm sorry.
What's the number of, or I'm sorry, not what's the number, what's the time span from the time that Cortés enters Tenochtitlan to when it falls? And if you could just talk about the moment when things turn between Cortés and Moctezuma and the conflict actually starts, it becomes a conflict.
Yeah. Actually, we're talking about a period of not completely 2 years now, and the things start to turn in 1520 when there was a big fiesta, a big ceremonial party going on in Tenochtitlan, and when Cortés actually had to leave the city in order to fight other Spanish troops who had been sent out by the governor of Cuba in order to pursue Cortés and to punish him, actually. So Cortés went out of the city of Tenochtitlan with a large group of soldiers in order to fight against his own European people, so to say. And he managed to do so quite successfully and actually gained strength from that, because he incorporated the troops that this people who had been sent out by Governor Velázquez of Cuba. When he came back, he found out that things had gone havoc in Tenochtitlan. And why? Because his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado had used the festivities of the Aztecs in order to massacre a large part of the Aztec elite, which had assembled there in order to celebrate peacefully their flower dances and so on. And he had massacred them. And of course, that was the turning point. There was no way back to a peaceful coexistence, and they were now the Europeans now found themselves besieged by the Aztecs. And in the course of the fights that were developing from there, the Tlatoani, the ruler Moctezuma, whom they had earlier taken hostage, died, and then the situation developed to be worse and worse, and in the end the Spanish had to flee Tenochtitlan in what they called the sad night. Of course, for the Aztecs that was the victorious battle of the dams, and in the end this group, this gang of Spaniards and their allies who survived. They had lost all their gold on the flight, and but they were lucky to come away with their lives, and then they had to go to Tlaxcala and regroup and to heal their wounds and so on. But they came back stronger, and then finally they actually made it. They with the big support of many different indigenous groups who by then had already taken the note that the Aztecs were not invincible. They were prone to military defeats, and that of course stimulated the long-held hope of getting rid of the onerous oppression by the Aztecs.
So when somebody says, somebody came up to you and said, Stefan, Cortés and 400 of his men took Tenochtitlan, why would you then say, no, that's not the case?
Yeah, because it's so obvious that they could never have succeeded in doing so without the assistance, and actually without following those very warlike indigenous groups who for many, many decades had already fought against the Aztecs, and who were now willing to risk it and to fight against the Aztecs and to join the forces. And we know that, and we also know how history is, of course, a treacherous thing. If we look at the sources, and the sources from Spanish hands have for centuries dominated our vision of that war. And of course, in these sources, the indigenous impact is hardly mentioned, because it would have diminished the Spanish glory, so to say. And from that point of view, we now know, thanks also to the research that has been done by many leading ethno-historians who have taken a second look at indigenous documents, that this indigenous impact was actually decisive. We might even go so far as to say that it were the indigenous people who co-opted this small band of Spaniards and took them with them, because, of course, they did have some sort of symbolic power with them because of their animals and of their firearms and so on. But that in itself would never have been sufficient to bring down the powerful city of Tenochtitlan. And then, of course, there's this other factor that I have to mention, and that is the germ warfare of the Spaniards, the germs that they brought with them, with the Europeans, and which sparked off a major epidemic in Mesoamerica, to which at crucial points in the war, for example, the successor of Moctezuma succumbed and died, and then many of the Aztecs people, of their elites, died. And also on the side, of course, there were also the indigenous allies of the Spaniards died, but the Spaniards took advantage of that by placing new rulers on top of these indigenous allies who were dependent upon them. And so in the end, it all worked out so well for the Spaniards, but that was mainly coincidental. And it had to do with the germs, and it had to do, of course, also with this powerful presence of the indigenous people who fought their war, and in 1521 went out victorious of these wars. But it were the Spaniards who had the vision of subduing the whole region, which the single indigenous states did not have. They were all happy of having gotten rid of the Aztec burdens, but none of them had the idea of building right away or right from scratch a new empire Aztec style, now with, for example, Tlaxcala as a center. They didn't have that. But the Spaniards did have that, and finally, because of the factors I just mentioned, turned out to be victorious and to build this new empire.
Yeah, and I have heard often the fact that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but something like 90% of the indigenous population of North America died from disease
That is true,
the
yeah.
Europeans came over, and that blows my mind. I mean, just imagine 90% of your town perishing. I mean, that's apocalyptic, and that really
not all of them perished from disease, but many also perished from the very fact, that the whole productive system was disrupted. There was no peasants anymore to work in the fields and so on. So there was a hunger epidemia going hand in hand with the illnesses and so on. And so that all really had devastating effects. And if we compare it to the pandemics of our own days, of course, we might see the difference. This is really the huge demographic catastrophe of human history. That is what happened in the Americas in that period.
Yeah, well, kind of lastly, my question for you is this topic. Why is this? Well, one, like, I'm curious if there are any other myths or anything else that you found in your research that you found to be especially noteworthy when it comes to some of the myths we have about this period of time, but also too just the lessons that that we have for today. What you would like your readers to be taking away from your book.
Yeah, there's of course the myth of Quetzalcoatl. This idea that the indigenous, the Aztecs, mistook the Spaniards for gods who had returned the feathered snake Quetzalcoatl, which is a real god in the Aztec pantheon. And we now know, of course, that although this belief might have played a role at the very beginning in when the indigenous tried to find out who these foreigners were, they soon found out that there were no gods they had to face, but rather human beings, kind of strange human beings, very stinking and and very funnily dressed, but they were now gods. But of course, what the Aztecs also believed was, and in that they were not so different from Europeans in the time, that the world beyond, that the world of ghosts and of gods and spirits and so on, might have an impact on their own lives, on their real world. And so that was something that they considered, or they might have considered, we don't know, but they might have considered the Spaniards to be, at some points having some kind of supernatural powers and so on, but they definitely did not consider them gods who had returned until the very end. And as what to take away from the whole story I'm telling, I think, is that we should be very careful when thinking about European superiority and when thinking about the basis of colonialism. We should think twice, and we should really delve into the sources in order to find out which other factors might have been crucial in bringing about the outcomes that we are familiar with. In our case, of course, we now know that it was a war that was not just fought between some few Spaniards and the powerful Aztecs, but it was a war that was fought by many different indigenous groups together with the Spaniards against an Aztec empire, which also had allies, some of whom remained, but most of who finally changed sides. And so it is much more a gray zone than a black and white zone in what direction you might want to have it.
Wonderful. Well, Stefan, thank you so much for joining me here today. What a fascinating topic.
Thank you, AJ. It was wonderful to talk to you. It was really a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
Actually, I've written another book about Latin America in the First World War, which you might be interested in at some other point.
What's the name of it?
It's Latin America in the First World War. It was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. So
all right,
years ago. But I don't know if you're only into the most recent books or.
Well, I don't discriminate. Whatever I think is interesting is what I pick up. Well, thank you for letting me know. And you've written 14 other books. Anything that you're working on right now? Is it number 15 on its way?
Right now, I'm doing smaller things. Actually, I'm writing a couple of articles. I'm a little out of the war history kind of thing. I'm more into political history, cultural history. Yeah.
Okay. Stefan Rinke, Conquistadors and Aztecs, A History of the Fall of Tenochtitlan. Go buy a copy. Go check it out from your library. What a fascinating topic. And Stefan, again, thank you so much.
Thank you, AJ. It was a pleasure.